Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. I haven't posted in about 2 months, but I've been doing a lot of writing and reading. And to start the new year off fresh, I'm going to give a summary of 10 books that I found very enjoyable, perhaps maybe even the best that I've read this year. So we're going to start off with a very easy, fun read. Maybe not fun, right? This is Osamu Dazai's No Longer Human. It is a fictional story which follows it's a sort of pseudo autobiography, right? The author does not call it an autobiography, but a lot of the events follow his life, and he doesn't differentiate. He doesn't give a clear mark when it is not an autobiography and when it is an actual thing that is occurring. But the story is technically purely fictional. So, Osamu Dazai is a very famous writer in Japan. And this book takes place in about the mid 20th century after the fall of Imperial Japan. What happens is this boy grows up in this like really rich family with all this like wealth and stuff, all the servants, but he feels alone, right? It's this following. It's a very dark, melancholic story following this boy who feels alone in his life, and every single person he meets, he thinks that they are just going to add to his despair, right? Because he experienced abuse and stuff by the servants in the house when he was a kid. So this book is very, very touching. It's a great story. The real life story is also very interesting because just like the book, the main character in the book, the author himself grew up very rich, experienced abuse from his like servants, and then this carried with him throughout his life, and it affected the way that he sees others. And it's just a very dark text, which can be interpreted in like a psychoanalytic framework as well to try and figure out, well, why does he act the way he does? Why does he do the things he does? Why does he act this way in relationships, etc.? So, highly recommend. Make sure you're not in a bad mood when you read this, because it'll really stress you out. So, the next text we're going to go through, number 9, is Heidegger's Introduction to Metaphysics. So, if you ever want to read Martin Heidegger and you want like a pretty decent text to start with, right here, Introduction to Metaphysics. One of the things that I really like about this text is that it sort of gives a breadth of Heidegger's view from not only being in time onwards. If you know Heidegger, you know that there's this like rift in his thought that occurred after being in time. Was released in I think like the late 1920s, but it not only prepares you for what is to come, like his essays on technology, his essays on art, but it also just sort of sums up his like overture up until then, right? He develops this concept of beings more, and then like the primordial being, right? And it's just a very good text if you want to start with Heidegger. The next text is St. Augustine's Confessions. Really, really enjoyable read. It's very uplifting, and it just you can read it so many times, and you just discover new ways to think about the text. What it details is St. Augustine's journey from being a Machinatian, which was a sort of heretical group of Christians at his time, from being that as a teen to then becoming a Christian, becoming a Catholic, right? And so it details a story. It also goes through his like early life. We see a lot of sort of very elementary attempts for like a linguistic theory, for like a theory about like childhood development. All this stuff is in this text. You also see, of course, his ideas about certain verses in the Bible, like Genesis 1, regarding like the ex nihilo version of Christianity. Augustine does not believe in creation ex nihilo. So it's just a very good text, very uplifting. And if you want to learn about a little bit about Platonism, a little bit about Catholicism, and just want a good uplifting text, there you go. Next one is Leibniz's Discourse on Metaphysics and the Monadology, specifically the Monadology, which is basically a 100-point list regarding Leibniz's entire philosophy. And he just literally lists it out, 1 point by one, till he gets to 100. It just explains his entire philosophy, his idea of the monad, right? This sort of closed, immaterial thing that only really becomes concrete when it conjoins with other monads, right? And this was Leibniz's response to like a autonomous doctrine, like a scientific doctrine, which would posit a material atom. Leibniz was like, no, the basic building block is the immaterial monad. I wrote an essay on Leibniz for school, and this text continues to be a great thing to return to. There's so many fun analogies he uses. He plays with the idea of mirrors a lot. So yeah, highly recommend Leibniz. It's certainly a pretty metaphysical text, which you have to have some sort of backing in Platonist thought, and even maybe some knowledge of the scholastics a little bit. But if you are prepared for this, I highly recommend Leibniz. He is surely not one to forget, even though many sadly have today. Plato's Timaeus, my favorite dialogue from Plato. No, it's not the Republic. No, it's not Parmenides. No, it's not the Sophist. It is Timaeus. Plato's Timaeus. What can be said? Well, Plato develops his idea of becoming much more thoroughly in this text, right? He develops the idea as an in-between between non-being and being, right? The becoming. And what something becomes in is the chora, which is this not space. But this not space is not entirely a localized concept, because the ancient Greeks didn't have a term for a space in extension, or a localized space. So when we think of chora and we think of this doctrine that Plato gives us, it sort of builds the building blocks to what I see as Hegel's beginning of the dialectic, right? The passing over from nothing, from being into nothing, or nothing into being, right? And Timaeus is also great. It gives Plato's sort of mythology of the beginning of history, the beginning of the world. It gives his geometric figures for different elements, right? You have like the triangular fire, air, water, and all that, earth. Just all around a great text, and I've read some scholarship on it, and it continues to be heavily debated as to like how important is it for Plato's ideas? Is this really him talking, or because he puts someone else in the place of Socrates? Is it not really his thoughts, right? There's a ton of great scholarly debates that occur about this text, and overall it is not one you can forget. The next text, we're going to be jumping into psychoanalysis with Alenka Zupancic's Ethics of the Real, Kant with Lacan. This text is extremely scholarly. One has to have quite a backing of Kant and Lacan to approach this. She does not spend time breaking down the terms. With Kant, she does some, but still, if you are expected to know what categories of the understanding are, and transcendental idealism, and what this accompanies, right? But all around a great text. She ties Kant's overture into Lacan's theory of subjectivity, Kant's idea of like the sublime, his idea of beauty. She even plays a little bit about his like metaphysics of appearance and tying it into Lacan. All around a great text for both Kantian and Lacanian scholarship. Lacan's Ecrits. Lacan called this book his garbage pile of writings, right? His rubbish writings, but I don't agree. There's some good essays in here, certainly. The one with Kant with Sade, really interesting to play with Kant's theory of morality and sort of inversing it with Sade, with Marquis de Sade. A great essay in here is Science and Truth, the last essay, which talks about Lacan's qualms with like the university system. Another great one is The Freudian Thing, where Lacan develops this concept of the thing more. The thing was largely developed in his 7th seminar in relation to ethics, but he develops it more in The Freudian Thing. Really interesting essay in here about criminality and how psychoanalysis can understand criminality. Lacan doesn't fall into these 19th century like essentialist ideas of criminality. Lacan takes a very sociological approach, and it's certainly and it was written in 1953, and it certainly still has importance today. So yeah, very difficult text, but if you've read Lacan seminars and you've read some secondary works, you could definitely take a stab at Ecrits. Slavoj Zizek's For They Know Not What They Do. Zizek's For They Know Not What They Do is a text which is one of Zizek's earliest, right? I believe it's his second earliest text from the early 90s. and it's a good introduction to his sort of work. This edition from 2008 has has like a long, very long foreword, 100 pages of a foreword, where Zizek basically introduces his more developed thoughts by now in 2008 than he had in 1993. He builds on some more. He talks about where he went wrong in his published work before this. And yeah, it's just all around a great text to learn about Zizek, to learn about the basics of not the basics of Hegel. Some like he will explain Hegel's dialectic in a certain number of words. Could certainly be simpler, but that's Zizek's writing. But certainly, if you want to start with Zizek, this was my first Zizek book that I read. That I don't count his book on Lenin because he just did like an introduction to it, right? But his first self-published title, we'll say. Now we're down to the top two. We have Hegel's Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences. This is the first Hegel's book that I read. Subsequently, I've now read his Lectures to Aesthetics, his early theological writings. I'm reading his Philosophy of History. So, but it's a great text to start with. It's certainly difficult, right? This is Hegel, right? When I say this is a great text to start with Hegel, I mean that you have to know what you're getting into. Certainly, you should have read Kant, you should have read Leibniz, you should have read Hume, you should have read Plato, you should have read Aristotle. Some other contemporaries, Schelling, take a stab at Schelling, Fichte, But if you're ready for Hegel, Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences is a great text. Hegel takes you through his dialectic, right? You sort of have three sections. You have being, you have essence, and you have the idea, right? And being is sort of, okay, we're thinking in very abstract terms, right? We get essence when we apply an other, and other gives determinate being. And then we get absolute idea. What is this all working towards, right? Well, what are we going towards? And this is where the final comes in, and it takes us all the way back to the beginning and says, from the beginning, you've already been there, right? You've already realized the beginning from the end, as it was always already there. You just didn't realize. The beginning, the end was at the beginning, right? It was always already there, but you just didn't realize it. And so once you reach the end of the text, you realize that, as Hegel says. Again, it's very difficult to summarize Hegel in the time that I'm permitting between these texts to explain them. My video on Hegel being in essence, comparison with Kant, will sort of give you a much better overview of Hegel's views on this text, because I largely based it off this. All right, so we are now at the last text on this list, and it is no other than Immanuel Kant himself, Critique of Pure Reason. Sometimes I want to be a Kantian. This text is great. There is not much more that can be said about this. Kant gives you his entire metaphysical or epistemic, depending on how you look at it, theory, right? You get his idea that the world is a bunch of appearances, that underlying the appearances is the phenomena, that we can never know the phenomena, but that we think phenomena to then apply our categories of the understanding and to group the phenomena together to make it a determinate being that we can now perceive and cognize and engage with and experience. It's just a great text, right? There's not much more that can be said. Kant's antinomies of pure reason, of course, you play around with those, this idea of subjectivity, which I already explained a little bit with Zupancic's book. But the transcendental eye, the eye of the appearance, it's certainly a theory of subjectivity which should be looked at in greater depth, and I think that a lot of modern philosophy has taken it to be so. So I have a video on my channel about this, Kant's Theory of Self, if you want to check that out. But Critique of Pure Reason, banger. We'll be rereading this for the rest of my life. There is so much you can gain from this text. So many different ways to look at it, right? You could write a PhD thesis on just one chapter, right? Certainly. So yeah, it's great. Not much more can be said. Highly recommend Critique of Pure Reason. That's going to be it for the video then. We've gone through 10 books that I think are very, good, enjoyable, the best that I've read this year, perhaps. So I highly recommend all of them, of course. And yeah, go ahead and subscribe down below, like the video, and stay tuned for more uploads in the year of 2023.